Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
We've got to make contact. One of us should actually try to speak to it.
Good idea.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
And today we had the privilege of speaking with Michael Jones, or you may know him as the guy who runs the Inspiring Philosophy channel on YouTube. So we're happy to have Michael Jones joining us. We're discussing the topic of divine hiddenness and a little bit about him. Michael's the founder and director of the nonprofit organization Inspiring Philosophy, dedicated to uncovering deep philosophical questions relating to the universe and life through research in philosophy, history, and science. Michael's made it his mission to present complex philosophical ideas in an accessible way to the public through his popular YouTube channel, Inspiring Philosophy. And they've got like 367,000 subscribers, so why don't you go join? We'll link to the show notes. And the videos cover topics ranging from evidence of God's existence, found in quantum mechanics, analyzing the Genesis creation narrative. I like these videos, Chad, because they're all really interesting and they are quite inspiring and entertaining and sometimes quite funny. And you can't watch one and not kind of like be like, yeah, that was good. So Chad, let's talk a little bit about the problem of divine hiddenness to prep our listeners. You have interest in the topic. I have interest in the topic. You've been going down the rabbit hole and some of these things, reading Schellenberg and things. Tell me a little bit about the rabbit hole that might summarize the overall idea.
Sure. Yeah. Just knowing that we were going to talk to Michael about divine hiddenness, I've been reading through Schellenberg, J.L. Schellenberg's book, The Hiddenness Argument. And I really have gained a great deal of respect for he's such a succinct writer and a very bright philosopher. I love how he's very much defines his terms and his premises. And so I admire the way he argues. Essentially, his argument can be boiled down to, and if you actually look up the argument, I think on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is a little lengthier than this, but here I'm just summarizing it. And it goes something like this. He argues that if God existed, then we wouldn't have non-resistant non-believers. And yet we do have non-resistant non-believers. And so he says that this shows that God does not exist. And again, that's not meant to be a formal argument. It's just meant to be a summary. And so that's one of the things I wanted to talk about Michael today, because I know he has some insights on the idea of what it means to be a non-resistant non-believer. And of course, this is the idea that this is someone who wants to know God. They're not actively resisting God, but yet they have not found God, I guess, for a colloquial way of putting it. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's kind of a summary of the argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Schellenberg's really emphasizing that point of non-resistant non-believers. I think that's one of the key pillars in his argument.
And he would argue that if an all-loving God existed, that he would want a relationship with his creations, and therefore there wouldn't be any non-resistant non-believers, because he would therefore reveal himself to them.
Yeah, so he could reveal his existence in a way that any open-minded person would have to believe, but he doesn't do it. And so the existence of non-believers who seem open to having a relationship with God but lack belief due to lack of evidence is seen as evidence of divine hiddenness. So there's a lot of different solutions to that, a lot of different ins and outs and angles you could take. So we're going to unpack some of those with Michael Jones today. Let's go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, Michael Jones, thank you for joining us for the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So, Michael, just give us a bit about your background, kind of how you became a Christian, what prompted you to start the Inspiring Philosophy YouTube channel, and some of your ministry goals.
Yeah, so I was raised in a pretty fundamentalist church, and that turned me off for various reasons. But after studying some of the arguments early on, I really became disillusioned with a lot of the atheist movement. And that's probably because my primary encounters were with mysticists, and I just found their arguments god-awful. So it pushed me into the direction of people like C.S. Lewis and other Christian apologists, and then I slowly but surely came back to Christianity. It was a slow, long process. And then over time, when YouTube was sort of getting going, I noticed there was not a strong presence on YouTube of Christians. It was mostly just atheists and young earth creationists. And I was like, well, there's got to be something better out there. And so at the time, I just had some basic security job where I didn't do anything for several hours. And so I thought, I guess I can make some videos. And that's how it all started going. So I started just trying to make a few videos and never intended it to be this big, but it just kept going, I guess.
Wow.
So you've been doing the YouTube thing for what, since 2011 or so? And so it's been around for a long time. You've got a lot of subscribers. What have you found to be the most popular sorts of videos that you produce?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a wide range of videos that have been popular. So I have videos on archaeology that got popular, videos on Genesis 1 to 11 that got popular. My theology videos, like my video on Does God Send People to Hell, have got pretty popular. My videos on why Jesus hasn't returned yet also got pretty popular. So I've had a pretty wide range of various topics that have sort of blown up, which I'm happy about.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons we asked you on the podcast is because I heard you on Frank Turek's podcast talking about hiddenness, and that led me to your inspiring philosophy video on hiddenness, which led me to your debate with Tyler Vila on hiddenness, and I just really appreciated a lot of the insights. And so before kind of unpacking it a bit, I was wondering if you could start by steelmanning the argument from divine hiddenness as it's posed as an objection to God.
Yeah, I'll do my best to steelman it. Some may disagree on how I word it, but
Sure.
Schellenberg's argument from divine hiddenness is if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. And if a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur. But when we look in reality, reasonable non-belief does occur. Therefore, no perfectly loving God exists. And to just quote Schellenberg here, he says, what a loving God has reason to do is provide us evidence sufficient for belief. One of the consequences of this is that moral freedom need not be infringed in order for God to be disclosed in the relevant sense. So what Schellenberg is basically arguing is that you don't have to infringe upon our freedom. You can just give us enough evidence of God's existence. But according to skeptics, there doesn't seem to be enough evidence for God's existence. And if God is loving, he'd want enough evidence for us so that we could make a fair choice to accept him or not. So this is an internal critique of theism. If God is perfectly loving, he should be providing everyone what they need to make a fair assessment and believe in him. And the skeptic argues that is not the case. There is reasonable non-belief. There are people that Schellenberg says are non-resistant non-believers, in that there are non-believers that would believe in God if given enough evidence, but they've not been given enough evidence. Therefore, this should not exist on theism. And that's generally how the argument would go.
Yeah. I'm currently working through the Hiddenness argument book, and I think that's an accurate representation. So just for clarification, do you think that, would you say reasonable non-belief is synonymous with resistant non-belief?
Yeah, I would say,
Okay.
I would say it's non-resistant non-belief. So when someone says they're a non-resistant non-believer, they would say, look, if you gave me enough evidence, I would believe, but I don't think there is enough evidence. That's why I don't believe.
Yeah. I know that in his book, The Hiddenness Argument, Schellenberg argues that it's a mistake to consider the argument from divine hiddenness as maybe an extension of the problem of evil. And this also came up in your debate with Tyler Vila. Tyler kind of argued that divine hiddenness and the problem of evil are two sides of the same coin. Do you agree with Schellenberg that that's a mistake, or would you go with more what Tyler says, that they're two sides of the same coin? How would you cash that out?
Well, I would say once you start working through the objections to the argument from divine hiddenness, it just sort of collapses to the argument from suffering. I don't really think the argument from divine hiddenness is a good argument when you dive into it. There's a lot of problems in the steps they make. And, this sort of came up in my debate with Tyler Vila. Was that after the opening statements, we immediately shifted to talking more about the problem of suffering. Because once you start pointing out the problems with the divine hiddenness argument, you start to go, well, this isn't really that big of an issue. This is just an extension of suffering in itself. So let's talk about the problem from suffering.
Yeah, that's helpful.
As an objection, my thoughts on it tend to lean towards the idea that it seems to come at things from a philosophical point of view with an idea of a God that the objector has in their head, and then say, well, if this God was loving, he would do this, rather than saying, well, from a theological perspective of what does the Bible say God is like and how might I approach him? So what are your thoughts on that where, in a sense, that philosophical argument is a different sort of theology of what God is like. And so therefore that God they're thinking of doesn't really exist anyway. How do you think through that?
Well, I think that's a good start. I would say it really does come from, and I don't mean this in a rude way, just a place of ignorance. I think people tend to assume a lot of things about what they would do in situations that they just is not the case. Like, for example, I've seen clips on the line. I've seen clips on the internet, for example, of people saying, if that person was here, I'd fight him. I'd tell him to his face what a horrible person he is. And then the person is standing right behind him and he turns around and he's super nice. We often tend to do that. We tend to say, if I was in this situation, this is how I would act. And we'd like to think highly of ourselves, but often when we get in those situations, we act in much different ways than what we thought. We can think of examples like there's been experiments done where people were brought into a room and they were told there's another participant on the other side of the room who was the person they were going to be experimenting on. And they were told to press a button to cause shocks to them. And each button they press slowly gives more electricity. But the person on the other side of the room who's supposedly being shocked is actually a paid actor. And he's told to say things like, "Oh, my heart, it's getting worse. Ah." And what the experiments have shown is that most people were going through and initiating all the shocks. And it surprised themselves a little bit because we tend to say, well, if I was in that situation, I would never do that kind of thing to a person. But when an authority figure is gearing down on you, telling you to do this thing, you won't receive the money for participating in the experiment if you don't go through with the whole thing. Some people fall under the pressure and they don't realize it. The way we like to think of ourselves in hypotheticals is not the way we actually are in reality, often the case. So when a non-believer says, if you just gave me the evidence, I would believe, I often go, well, how do you know that? How do you know this is how you would respond? How do you know you would respond in the right way? Some people think, for example, if you gave me the evidence, I'd be a good Christian. But what if God knows that if, there actually is a non-resistant non-believer out there? What if God knows that if he was given all the evidence right now, he turned into like a member of the Westboro Baptist Church or someone like Steve Anderson or just a horrible Christian? Maybe it's better, as some philosophers have argued, like Tim Stratton, maybe it's better for God to wait, to withhold evidence from someone for a certain amount of time, maybe even up till just about they're about to die, because God knows the kind of person they would turn into. They could turn into a very legalistic, maybe a prosperity gospel type believer. So there's a lot of assumptions to go into this when you were talking about these non-resistant non-believers or these people that just say they just need enough evidence. Maybe they wouldn't believe like they think, or maybe if they did believe, they wouldn't turn out to be a very good Christian. Maybe they'd be a very harmful and hateful Christian. Like, we can't say for sure, but an omniscient God could say.
Yeah. So there's a few different strands we could pull on there. One I see is what people think they would do if they had a certain amount of evidence. They might have a certain idea in their head what that evidence might look like, and then they actually wouldn't respond in that way. Another thread might be the aspect of middle knowledge. Well, God has sufficient moral reasons for withholding particular kind of revelation that would convince that person or whatever. Not that convincing a person is the ultimate goal, but the other aspect would be the assumptions of God would do this if he were who we think he is. The wrong idea of the God they're supposedly seeking. He would do this, he would do that. So on that side of that coin, what are your thoughts on assumptions people are smuggling in there or unknowingly maybe have about their idea of God? Like, oh, he's this perfectly loving father, and here's my picture in my head of what a perfectly loving father would do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we have the wrong idea there. So I think we need to remember that God, of course, is omniscient. He's able to see all future paths of a person and know what would happen if they would go down certain paths. So maybe God is being more loving, protecting us from certain things that we may not be aware of. So, for example, if you just read, for example, the book of Exodus, it talks about the Israelites are rescued. They're given all these vast miracles. And what do? They complain. They become selfish. They become self-centered. We tend to think, well, if God did all that, we'd all just believe it and become good Christians. But if we're going on what the actual Christian worldview teaches, It's that human nature is so corrupt we wouldn't. What happens is we become selfish. We become complacent. We expect God to keep doing things for us. And I compare this with something in my life that I have experienced over time. So people come to me and they email me and they ask me all sorts of questions. Hey, what about this in Genesis? What about this in 2 Kings? What about this in the Gospel of Mark? And when I first started out, I'd answer every question and I'd spend hours a day doing that. It was very time consuming. And what I learned over time is A, I don't have enough time for that. But B, I wasn't helping people really become critical thinkers. Because what was happening is I would answer their question and then the next day they'd find another question. And then they'd come to me and say, well, he answered my question yesterday. He'll just do it again for me. I don't have to think about this. I don't have to look for an answer. He'll just do it for me because that's his job. And he already has set the precedent that he'll do it. So I would be going through emails hours and just typically the same people over and over again. And I realized it wasn't helping them. They were just treating me like a secretary. It wasn't helping me. It wasn't helping them. And so I've just learned I just can't do that anymore. I ignore over the overwhelming majority of messages I get because people just assume that if they come to me once, I'm just going to start answering all their questions for them. And that's not everyone, obviously, but that's a lot of the people that have been messaging me. And so I've just learned that, look, I have all these videos up. You got to learn to do your own research. I use sources in these videos. Why don't you check those sources out? Stop just coming to me when you have a problem. Learn to be your own critical thinker. And that can be comparable to with God sometimes. If he just showed up, gave us all our answers, gave us all the miracles we need to make ourselves happy, how do you think we would respond? I think we would respond in a very selfish way. Well, God, you're like a magic butler. You gave me everything I needed last time. You'll do it again this time. And God wants us to be sanctified. He wants us to mature, to become selfless. And often him showing up as a powerful deity and giving us everything we need may not result in the type of character he wants or the type of persons we think we would be if that was the case. And if you read the Gospels, it says they were going to force Jesus to be their king after he multiplied bread and fish for them. Jesus left because that was not his purpose. He wasn't there to become their magical food maker and just be their king and grant them all their wishes.
Sure.
In the book of Acts, it says, the disciples said, are you now going to restore the kingdom of Israel? Referring to the kingdom of David. And he's like, no, that's not my purpose. I came to die for sins and create a real kingdom of heaven, not another earthly kingdom. So even to that point prior to the Pentecost, they still did not get it. And so often we think, well, if God just gave me all the evidence, this is how I would respond. And I can cite numerous examples where that just isn't the case. Even in the Milgram experiments I mentioned earlier about the electric shock thing. No, people were not responding in the loving and kinding ways we assume we would in those situations. It's really unfortunate that oftentimes we don't understand our own human nature.
Yeah, I think it's a good point there. God's not this on-demand God who just answers to us.
Michael, you hinted at this and talked about it a little bit, but I for our listeners, I wanted you to expand on it because I find your thinking here really helpful. Schellenberg's kind of one of his key contentions, if not the key contention, is that there is the existence of these non-resistant non-believers. But if I understand your work correctly, you're quite skeptical of the idea that a non-resistant non-believer actually exists. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I don't see any evidence in psychology that humans are non-resistant non-believers. We as humans tend to defend our beliefs with a fight or flight response. We tend to treat them as if we're being attacked when our own beliefs are attacked. And this is even on very little things. Things like, is Christmas pagan? I've been doing this for years, pointing out Christmas has no pagan origins. And people are shocked when I say that. And they go, no, you're just wrong. You're stupid. And then I give them the evidence and they still believe Christmas is pagan. And most people I have showed that to still believe it is pagan, despite me giving the evidence. And it's especially with people that have made a public proclamation that Christmas is pagan. The moment they have a video or an article or even a Twitter post claiming it's pagan, they defend that until the day they die. Sometimes people who have not made those come around, but other times the other way. We defend our beliefs in ways that are very emotional, very tribal, a very much fight or flight response. And that's just as human nature. We all have rational reasons for our beliefs, but we also have emotional reasons. We as Christians need to admit that we do want Christianity to be true because A, we don't want to admit we were wrong about something. Humans don't like admitting that. We also like the idea of the afterlife, seeing our loved ones again. Those are emotional reasons to believe in Christianity. I'm not going to deny that. there are emotional reasons to deny Christianity. It's as John Milton said, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Not submitting to a powerful deity, admitting that you're a sinner, admitting that you need someone to atone for your sins, admitting that your sins are so bad that God has to actually die for them. Those are hard things to admit as someone who's a non-believer. So to say that everyone's just a non-resistant non-believer, I don't think you've studied your own psychology that much. And studies do show this. I mean, I've cited studies like in my video on divine hiddenness, where parents that favored childcare, or daycare that is, were compared with parents who favored home care. And they were both given two bogus studies. The parents that favored daycare said, well, the daycare study is just very accurate. And they used various reasons to justify it, and then various reasons to dismiss the home care study. They did the same. The other group did the exact same thing in the opposite direction. We tend to defend our beliefs and justify them and use all sorts of reasonings to get ourselves there. This is just part of human nature. So I do believe there are many atheists that have valid reasons for rejecting Christianity. I don't think, however, they're being honest in saying that those reasons are not also tied with emotional reasons. We have both. And your human psychology is so that we cannot divorce them. We will always have emotional and rational reasons for rejecting certain beliefs and accepting the current beliefs that we have. One of the big ones being is we don't want to admit we were wrong and change tribes. Changing tribes, even ideological tribes, can be hard. I remember one time I was talking to an atheist private, I won't say who it was, and he just said like, well, you know, people like us, we can never change our beliefs because we lose all our donors. And I said,
Wow.
well, yeah, but I mean, like, I said to him, like, but if I came out as a non-believer, I mean, think of the books I could write and the attention I'd get, all the interviews I'd have. I mean, like, there would be good things to that. And if you became a Christian, you know, we would rally around you and like help you out as much as we could. And of course, he came up with other excuses as well. I mean, this is just the way humans are. I, as a Christian, need to admit that's the way my psychology is, and I have to wrestle with that on a daily basis. I give the example of something I did, is I made a 75-minute Exodus documentary. And then a couple days later, an Egyptologist, David Falk, criticized it. And he posed a lot of valid criticisms. I took that documentary down and redid it. That was one of the hardest decisions I ever had to make. Now, after people congratulated me, they said it was very honest of me. But during that, I didn't feel like that. I felt like a loser. I felt like I was an idiot. I felt like I made huge mistakes. I misled people. That's typically what happens when you change your beliefs. Those are the shameful feelings that come along with it. We need to recognize that, and we need to fight that as much as we possibly can if we're going to say we're committed to finding the truth. And so I encourage people to try to take that mentality. And because I was encouraging people to take that mentality, I knew I had to take that mentality.
That's commendable. So essentially, would it be correct then to say that the idea that Schellenberg's suggestion that non-resistant non-believers exists may be a bit short-sighted and not taking the whole of human psychology into account, and also almost treating humans as if they're indifferent, entirely objective reasoning machines?
It's an oversimplification of human psychology, and you're absolutely right. We're not just reason machines.
Okay.
It really is just an oversimplification. And when people say they're non-resistant non-believers, I'm like, okay, fine. Like, then I'm a non-resistant believer. Now what? Now we're in the same boat. I mean, really, the divine hiddenness argument is just the argument from religious belief in reverse. You know, a Christian preacher runs up to someone and says, Jesus revealed himself to me. He's real. Believe in him. The atheist runs up to someone and says, Jesus hasn't revealed himself to me. He's not real. Don't believe in him. Most Christians are not going to be convinced by non-belief for the same reason that non-believers are not going to be convinced by religious belief. So it's really not a convincing argument. It's about as good as an argument as the argument from religious belief is. And philosophers have made the religious belief argument, but they've made it as like a secondary argument. Like they say it's only sort of so good as long as we have other arguments like contingency and moral arguments and other like resurrection arguments and that kind of stuff. So I just wish that we would be honest about what the argument from, non-belief or divine hiddenness is. It's just the argument from religious belief in reverse.
That's helpful.
I sometimes think about this idea of hiddenness of like, okay, take that word away and say, well, you have got a group of people who have discovered something or claim to have found something, and then another group of people who claim to have looked around and not found that thing. And it would seem like there would be more credit or weight put on those testimonies cumulatively of those who have found this thing they're looking for than the people who haven't discovered it yet. Because if we're talking about an object, that object is yet to be found. It doesn't mean that you just haven't found it yet. So I don't know why there should be so much credit given to people when they just haven't found it yet. If they were honest, in my mind, and they were saying, well, I'm really trying to find the Christian God, and he says, seek and keep on seeking. Well, if you stop and you don't find him, well, who's to blame if you're looking for the Christian God? For me, I'm always frustrated by it because it ignores what prescriptions there are in the scripture about the fact that God does hide himself and that we are to seek and keep seeking, and that there are certain preconditions for his revealing himself to us.
Another thing to add to that is that like 90% of people who've existed have believed in some sort of higher power. Yet we're supposed to favor this very, very small minority that is not convinced there is any sort of higher power as sort of like evidence in favor of like divine hiddenness. It's like, well, actually, most humans are convinced there is something divine. So, I mean, at least we should accept that maybe that the argument from divine hiddenness can only be like argued against maybe like specific religions, perhaps. But to just simply say that I'm not convinced that there is something divine, very hard to argue, given that most humans actually do believe there is something divine. Most humans have existed. There's only a small minority of people that have existed that have taken this view. Even people that identify as unaffiliated with religious, the overwhelming majority of them still believe in some type of higher power.
And back to that idea that, if their definition of God is a God who just replies on demand, then yeah, that God doesn't exist.
Well, we need to talk about the whole issue that why God would be hidden in the way he is. Well, we wouldn't say that he's entirely hidden because we say he's revealed himself to us in the scriptures and various miracles, personal experiences, these kinds of things that Christians will use. But why is he not like clearly just seen up in the sky or something by everyone? So I think we need to realize that, what is God actually doing? He's not trying to create basic theism. I mean, James says even the demons believe and they tremble. He's trying to create what Paul Moser says is cognitively robust theism. The idea that we not just believe in God, but we love him and love him for the right reasons. So he's trying to sanctify us. And it's very clear that God can create cognitively robust theists without giving every single human basic theism. In fact, we would argue that giving every human basic theism may lead to more selfishness, more pride, and just not believing in God for the right reasons, misusing him, treating him like a magical butler. So maybe if it's the case that God wants sanctified believers, maybe he has to have that type of hiddenness so that he can actually sanctify us. There's an old hymn called Come Thou Fount. In that hymn, the line is, on that day I'm free from sinning, I shall see thy face. It's this idea that C.S. Lewis talks about until we have faces, that we can't see God's face yet because we've not been fully sanctified. So we have to go through this process where he is sort of just not apparent to us like face to face because we've not been sanctified. We wouldn't treat him properly. And if God can create cognitively robust, sanctified Christians without giving everyone the whole entire world apparent evidence of him, then maybe he knows what he's doing. Maybe he knows this is the actual way to create the type of believers, the type of followers he wants, and making apparent theism or basic theism obvious to every human would actually be a hindrance to that. So again, divine hiddenness, it just misses the entire mark because it just has a lot of assumptions in it, like non-resistant non-believers, missing the understanding of Christian sanctification, missing the idea of human psychology, has all these assumptions built into it that just don't map onto reality or what Christianity actually teaches. If Christianity is true, we should expect some type of hiddenness there because we're not fully sanctified, and God needs to sanctify us before we can fully see him and be in perfect communion with him.
What do you think about Pascal's statement where he says that there's enough light for those who want to believe, but there's enough dimness, so to speak, for those who are a contrary disposition?
Oh, absolutely. And Jesus says the same thing in the Gospel of Luke. He says in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, he says, if they have Moses and they have Moses and the prophets. And then the rich man says, no, someone's going to go back from the dead. And Abraham, through the mouth of Jesus, says, if they will not believe Moses and the prophets, they will not believe even if someone rises from the dead. So I think there is plenty of evidence out there. And, I've gone through very simple things with people. Like, here's a debate I love to have with atheists. Not did Jesus rise from the dead, but was Jesus buried in a tomb? That's a natural thing. Many people were buried in the tomb. Let's have that debate first before we debate if Jesus rose from the dead. And when I get them in that room, I start questioning them on this and on that and on this. And it's very easy to show the double standards flowing out. It's very easy to show, like, they're going to say that Jesus was left on the cross, the rod. He wasn't buried in a tomb because they've got this presupposition that Rome wouldn't allow it. And I go, why wouldn't Rome allow it? Well, because Pilate was a tyrant. He would never allow that. Well, where are you getting that from? Josephus. Well, Josephus says that he put Roman shields in Jerusalem, and then the Jews protested, and he surrounded them with Roman soldiers ready to take their lives, and they bore their necks ready to give their lives. And Pilate relented. He bluffed. He didn't kill anyone, and he took the shields off. He gave in to the Jews. Then it says that he used money from the temple to build an aqueduct. The Jews protested. He put soldiers in to disperse the crowd, but told his soldiers not to kill anyone. But the soldiers went too far and killed people. Pilate doesn't seem like this absolute tyrant that wants to murder and cause harm to the Jews. He actually seems like a pretty reasonable guy who doesn't want to cause too much harm. And he was governor for like 10 years. If he was governor for that long, obviously he was doing something right. So then they move on to that's just one example of them just having this presupposition that doesn't match the data. And I've had this debate twice now. And so I have that debate on purpose because it's a natural event. You can't say it's something supernatural. You're not going to believe in something supernatural. But it's very easy to show the atheists, quite honestly, are not being fair with the evidence that Jesus was buried in a tomb. We have overwhelming evidence Jesus was buried in a tomb, but they have this presupposition Rome wouldn't allow it. Why? Well, because Rome wouldn't allow it. And it's like, well, let's go through the data. Let's go through the early Roman sources that show that crucified victims could be buried. We have archaeological evidence that could be buried. We've got good reasons to think Pilate would allow it. Here. It's multiply attested. But no, they won't do it. And the other thing I'll use is like, okay, well, if Rome typically killed Jewish rebels by nailing them to a cross and leaving them to a rot, why do you doubt Josephus when he says that Simon Bar Giora, the Jewish rebel from the Jewish War of 70 AD, was actually taken back to Rome and either beheaded or thrown off a rock? Why don't we just dismiss that because we got this presupposition Rome would crucify them and put them on a cross to rot? Well, they don't. They believe Josephus there, but they won't believe the early Christians that say Jesus was crucified yet buried. There's a lot of just presuppositions that go into this. So I have that debate because I want to expose that, no, we're not really being fair with the evidence. How can we trust you to be fair with the evidence for the resurrection if we can't even get past the burial argument? I know that will upset some atheists. I know that will upset some non-believers. I don't care anymore. I've been around this. I've gone through the burial debate dozens of times in messages or in comment sections and in live debates now. And again, I just don't think people are being fair with the evidence if you're going to deny Jesus was buried. And I've got so many other arguments I can use against that.
Well said. One of the things I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to, and I know much of what you've said today will speak to this, but one of the analogies that are often used to illustrate divine hiddenness is that parent-child example. And I know that Tyler pressed this quite a bit. Typically, there are a few different forms, but it typically goes something like this. I have kids, and if my kids needed comforted or they needed to know that I was there for them, I would do everything I could to let them know. But yet here I was crying out to God and he seemed absent. There was no comfort there for me. What do you think of that?
Well, I can't psychoanalyze anyone, so I don't know exactly what was going on through their brains. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes we tend to think we would act a certain way if given that evidence, and then we actually are put in situations and we don't respond the way we thought we would prior to that. The way we see ourselves hypothetically is not how we actually are in reality often. So that's one thing to first point out. The next thing to point out is, sometimes God does want us to go through a period of storm, a period of suffering, for various reasons that might be connected with our own psychology that we may not be aware of. I went through times of suffering. I went through times where I didn't feel God was there. And looking back on it, I'm glad I did because it helped make me into a better person, I think, ultimately. I look at myself when I was 20 and I was a narcissist. And I'm not perfect now, but I at least hope I'm getting better. People look at their past selves and cringe. I do that all the time. So that kind of thing. And the other thing to think about is God is not like a human parent. He's far greater than this. We compare God to a loving father, but he's far more than that. Sometimes it cannot just be that simple because we're talking about an omnipotent, omniscient God versus a human parent here. Sometimes the way we would respond to an omniscient, omnipotent creator is not going to be how we respond to just another human parent. So there's a huge difference in terms of ontology there that needs to be recognized. It's not going to be the same thing. If my father walked in and like I needed comforting, sure. But if a genie walked in, I might be treating the genie a little bit differently, like, getting certain wishes that I want because, my selfish inclinations are going to show up when a very powerful grant wishing being can show up. Certain aspects of me I may not be aware of right now can manifest in ways that I was not aware of until I'm actually in that situation. But with another mortal human, they're not going to manifest because we recognize the difference in ontology. So we need to be aware of these ontological aspects that we just tend to overlook when making these comparisons.
Yeah, I think that's good. It's good to point out that there's limits to that comparison. I really like that it only gets you so far. I have just one more question regarding the hiddenness argument, and that would be, when I wrote this question or thought this question through, I guess would be a better way to put it, I was kind of had someone like Alex O'Connor in mind, where Alex claims to be a non-resistant non-believer as far as I understand it, and he believes that if he had an experience with God, to him, it's almost like an emotional experience. I get this, or a comfort or an inner peace, then he would believe. Kind of a couple questions off of that. Do you think that's a necessary condition for belief to have that experience? And also, do you think that's a reasonable expectation?
No, I don't think it's a reasonable expectation because I don't even know what that would feel like. I mean, what would that feel like? And how would you know it was just you're not just having a good day? I mean, this is something that's so deep in someone's own psychology. It's hard for me to even speak of like what that feeling would be for you, or how would that differ from a normal feeling? I mean, this is one of those types of things. It's like, what are you asking God to do here? Like basically just show up and give you like an extraordinary miracle? Maybe that wouldn't generate the type of cognitively robust theism or the loving type of response that God would want. Again, it just seems like we're making a lot of assumptions about our own psychology that just don't map onto reality. And again, I would just say, let's talk about the actual evidence here. Let's talk about your own arguments for resisting Christianity. Honestly, when I get an atheist talking long enough, a lot of the emotional objections will come out. Yes, they do have rational objections. A lot of those ones are easily cleared, though, once you deal with the emotional objections. Like, I don't think a loving God would send people to hell. All right, let's talk about hell. Let's talk about C.S. Lewis and the Great Divorce. Let's talk about how the only people that are in hell are the people who want to be there. And so let's talk about the problem of suffering. Okay, let's talk about the whole issue of triumph and how God is going to make everything right and the whole nature of human sin. And, I think a lot of the emotional objections are going to be a lot stronger, which do manifest in things like the problem of evil, the problem of divine hiddenness, the problem of hell, these kinds of issues. But when it comes to people just saying those type of things, like if I just got this immense peace, I'd believe in God. I'm like, but you'd still have those other objections you had before, like the problem of hell, the problem of suffering, right? I mean, that wouldn't clear those, would it? So obviously, we still have to wrestle with those issues regardless. Maybe we should just start focusing on those issues and then start studying the gospel, study how Christ died for you, study what Christ goes through. Watch my video, The Absurdity of Christianity, where I address some of those things. And let's see the love of God. And then let's see if the peace comes from that kind of understanding. When I talked about a lot of new baby Christians, they'll say things like, I finally became a Christian because I realized how much I was a sinner. I realized how much my sin needed forgiven. And I realized what Christ had to go through to deal with my sin. And once I took those steps, then the other objections just sort of fell over quite easily. Quite honestly, it always starts with that first step. People start to realize they aren't perfect. I think one of the biggest difference between the Christian and the skeptic is, what do you think of humanity? And often I will see the atheist or the person who's leaving Christianity in this example start to say, things like, well, I think humanity is innately good, or I think humans are naturally good. And I see people coming to Christianity start saying the opposite. I start to see how evil humanity is, how evil I truly am in my own nature. And then they start to realize they need a savior. This is not always the case, but often I do see this as the process. It starts with beginning who you are. And I see the people leaving Christianity starting with the symptom of, well, humans are actually pretty good. We're not that bad. We don't really need a savior. And I think God is over-exaggerating sin. Is it really that bad? And it's the exact opposite when people start to come to Christ.
Wow, some good insights there.
I always think of that quote from Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade, only the penitent man will pass. You know, you have to bow down first before you come to God. Let's say there's someone who's listening and they're thinking, well, you know, I've tried to pray, but God's not there. I kind of am sympathetic to this, you know, argument from Hiddenness because, you know, God doesn't seem to be showing up. How might that person seek God? What would your advice to be for someone who says, hey, this objection seems strong to me because I don't see him showing up or revealing himself?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this. And typically I'll say something like follow the evidence, just study the evidence for the resurrection. And I think you need to do that. Study the evidence for the New Testament. You know, read scholars like Craig Blomberg, Mike Licona, Gary Habermas is another good one. Check out some of the videos I do on this type of stuff, but there's more to it than that. And one of the things I try to tell people is try to be a selfless person. Try to live out the actual gospel into the point where you are just a totally selfless person. If you truly think you are a good person, prove it and actually go out and be that. And when I've told people to do that privately, they start to realize how hard it is. They start to recognize their own sin in ways they didn't realize before. And I mean truly be selfless. Don't have any hateful thoughts. Don't have any lustful thoughts. Don't have any selfish thoughts. Like, don't do something because you might gain from it, and actually, like, try to experience agape love. And then start to realize how much of a sinner you are and how much you need grace and how much you need a savior. And, you know, you mentioned something earlier about, you know, we do come and bow to Christ and ask for forgiveness. And that is a reason to reject Christ because that's a humbling experience most people don't want to go through. But what I tell people is, yes, you do need to bow to Christ. But once you do, you'll look up and realize the throne is empty. Before you is just a man with nail marks in his hands, and he's ready to wash your feet. Because Christ is not a God who sits on his throne and throws down orders from heaven, but he's a God who gets off his throne and comes down and picks us up and carries us to heaven. So you need to recognize who you're submitting to. This is not a God who wants to shame you. It's a God who wants to humble you, but that's because he humbled himself. And he wants you to realize that he took the shame for you. So there's much more to Christianity than what you think it is. And so start to study that. Start to study why God needed to die for your sin, why it was that important. And see if you can actually be the good person you think you are. I see a lot of people that are very interested in helping humanity. We need to pass this law, pass that law. We need to help humanity. If you really wanted to help humanity so much, why don't you start by helping your neighbor? Often we are so busy focusing on helping humanity, we forget to help our neighbor. And often the reply I get is, well, I can't be sure about that because what if they're like a Trump supporter or a fascist or a communist or a socialist, these kinds of things. Well, then you really don't want to help humanity because you can't even start by helping your neighbor. You're judging them based on political differences. If you truly are this compassionate person you are that wants to help humanity, pass all these laws that are going to help humanity, prove it. Start by helping your neighbor out and start by living out the gospel.
That's good. Well, Michael, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your insights with us. We'll make sure in the show notes we have the podcast with Dr. Turek. We'll make sure that we have your video on divine hiddenness and your debate with Tyler Vila. Are there any other resources that you would point listeners to? Of course, we'll include your channel, Inspiring Philosophy, but any resources on divine hiddenness that they might find helpful?
Tim Stratton, I mentioned it in my debate with Tyler Vila.
Yes.
Tim Stratton wrote a paper that's really good. Paul Moser's book on divine hiddenness is good. Each chapter has a different author, so you get all these different perspectives, which I always enjoy. And check out my debate with Tyler Vila. I really thought in that debate, I got to hash out a lot of these issues, and we had a great conversation, and I think I got what I wanted out of that debate. And so I was really happy with that outcome.
Super.
Thank you.
Well, Michael, appreciate all your videos. We'll point people to Inspiring Philosophy YouTube channel. A lot of great stuff. Now, You mentioned, I've been seeing a lot of these Halloween videos you've been doing, and you've mentioned doing Christmas videos, and you're doing a lot of YouTube shorts, which are quite entertaining, by the way.
Yes.
Anything we should be looking for on the horizon?
Well, I'll keep doing shorts. That's what I'm always going to keep doing those. I'll do seasonal shorts and responding to people, but I'm currently working on a series of the reliability of the Gospels. I think it's going to be like 12 or 13 parts.
Awesome.
And I only have 3 up so far, so I'm going to be going through a lot of stuff and arguing they are eyewitness accounts. A few years ago, I saw a lot of skeptics online making 3 objections. One, the documentary hypothesis is the best explanation of the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. He preached the end of the world in the 1st century, and the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. And so I've been setting out over the past several years to debunk all 3 of those. Finishing up my series on the documentary hypothesis, I did a series showing Jesus was not a failed apocalyptic prophet, and now I'm doing the series showing the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. So that's what I'm working on now.
Excellent.
Great. Appreciate your work. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.